What if the real danger in our world isn't evil, but ignorance that doesn't even know it's ignorant? What if the most dangerous people aren't those who plan to do harm, but those who are so convinced of their own rightness, they become blind to the harm they cause? You've probably met someone like that. They speak with absolute certainty. They quote things they don't understand. They argue louder the more wrong they are. And somehow they always sound like they know exactly what they're talking about. But here's the terrifying part. They believe they're helping. They don't think they're spreading misinformation. They think they're spreading truth. They don't know they're being used. They think they're in control. And that's exactly why Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a man who watched Germany fall under Nazi rule, called stupidity more dangerous than evil. Think about it. We live in a time where influencers with no expertise offer medical advice to millions, and people listen. Fake news spreads faster than truth. Deepfakes blur the line between reality and fiction. Algorithms reward outrage, not understanding. We scroll past experts and pause on loud confidence. We're drawn to the people who sound sure, not those who actually are. Why? Because certainty feels safe, even when it's built on nothing. And that's the trap. Bonhoeffer saw this up close. Hitler didn't rise to power through reason. He did it by manipulating people who had already surrendered their ability to think independently. They didn't ask questions. They followed slogans. They obeyed, not because they were evil, but because they no longer recognized truth. Now ask yourself, is it really so different today? This isn't just a history lesson, it's a warning. If we don't recognize this kind of dangerous stupidity, the kind that thinks it's doing good, we can't protect ourselves from it. We'll keep arguing with people who won't listen. We'll keep trusting those who sound confident but lead us nowhere. And slowly, we'll lose our ability to think for ourselves. So before we go deeper into Bonhoeffer's theory, stop and ask yourself, have I ever followed the crowd just to avoid standing alone? Have I ever accepted a truth because it was easy, not because it was right? If so, you're not alone, and you're not doomed, but you are responsible, because seeing the threat is the first step toward resisting it. And Bonhoeffer, he spent his life trying to wake people up. Now it's our turn. So who was the man behind this terrifying idea that stupidity is more dangerous than evil? Dietrich Bonhoeffer wasn't a philosopher in a quiet room. He wasn't a distant academic. He was a pastor, a theologian, and eventually, a resistor of the Nazi regime. He lived through the collapse of reason, watched his country transform from a place of culture and intellect into a machine of blind obedience. He saw what happens when thinking dies, not because people can't think, but because they choose not to. And in the middle of that storm, Bonhoeffer wrote something that still haunts the world today. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. But he didn't mean ignorance. He didn't mean lack of education. He meant something much darker. Bonhoeffer noticed something terrifying. Evil, for all its power, is visible. You can fight it. You can expose it. Evil always leaves behind a trace of guilt, a sense of unease. But stupidity is invisible because it's disguised as righteousness. He saw intelligent men in Germany, professors, doctors, pastors, give up critical thinking when it became inconvenient. They didn't argue. They agreed. They shared slogans. They silenced questions. They put their faith not in truth, but in the rising wave of power. This wasn't stupidity of the mind. It was a surrender of the will. Have you seen that before? Maybe on social media, when someone refuses to question a viral lie because it supports their side. Maybe in politics, when followers echo their leaders without understanding the cost. Or even at home, when people defend harmful ideas just because it's what we've always believed. That's what Bonhoeffer feared. Not evil men plotting in secret, but ordinary people losing themselves in the comfort of certainty. Bonhoeffer's warning wasn't just philosophical. It was prophetic. He paid for it with his life. Arrested by the Nazis, he was executed for his role in the resistance, a man silenced for daring to think when everyone else had stopped. But before he died, he left us this insight. That stupidity isn't an intellectual failure, it's a moral failure. It happens when people stop asking questions and start following blindly. So why did Bonhoeffer fear the stupid? Because he had already seen what they were capable of, when they didn't even know what they were doing. And now, with deep fakes, misinformation, and blind loyalty echoing across screens and governments, his fear is no longer history. It's a mirror. Bonhoeffer didn't fear ignorance. He feared the moment when thinking dies in public, not from lack of intelligence, but from the slow decay of moral will. When people choose imitation over investigation, when comfort becomes more sacred than truth. This wasn't a theory to him, it was lived reality. He saw intelligent men, scholars, doctors, clergy abandon thought like shedding an old coat. They didn't need to be forced. They welcomed obedience. And once the slogans were repeated enough, once the crowd moved in one direction, asking why became dangerous. This wasn't stupidity as a personal flaw. It was stupidity as a social infection. And modern psychology backs this up. In the 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch conducted a deceptively simple experiment. Participants were shown a line and asked to match it to one of 3 comparison lines. The correct answer was obvious. But what the real subject didn't know was that everyone else in the room had been told to give the wrong answer. What happened? 75% of participants conformed to the group's false answer at least once. Not because they believed it, but because they didn't want to stand out. Even when the truth was clear, they chose to doubt their own eyes rather than question the crowd. And that, Bonhoeffer realized, is the true danger. Stupidity is not loud, it is quiet. It does not rebel, it obeys. It blends in, smiles, repeats what it's told, and in doing so, it silences everyone who might have spoken up. It replaces judgment with repetition, reflection with reflex, conscience with compliance. And eventually, obedience itself becomes a virtue. Loyalty is praised, doubt is punished, and those who still think begin to wonder if they're the crazy ones. That's what makes stupidity more dangerous than evil. Evil is conscious, it calculates, it feels guilt even if it ignores it. But stupidity, it doesn't know what it's doing, it believes it's right. It spreads not because it's powerful, but because it's innocent in its certainty. Bonhoeffer put it clearly, against stupidity, we are defenseless. Not because we are weak, but because stupidity wears the mask of goodness. It cannot be argued with because it believes it's on the side of truth. It cannot feel guilt because it sees itself as righteous. And so, evil no longer needs to seduce the crowd. It just needs to whisper in the right ears and let stupidity do the rest. We live in a world where that whisper has become an algorithm, where certainty is rewarded and questioning is punished, where misinformation spreads faster than reflection, where viral confidence replaces real competence. This is no longer a theoretical threat. It's structural, it's digital, it's cultural. And it begins the moment we stop asking why. Not because we don't know better, but because slowly we forget that we should. Because the danger isn't just in ignorance. It's in how ignorance, repeated enough times, becomes a habit. And habits, when shared by millions, become a culture. A culture that no longer questions. That obeys not because it understands, but because it's easier. Stupidity, Bonhoeffer warned, doesn't remain harmless. It evolves. Left unchecked, it becomes a tool, a silent weapon in the hands of those who know how to direct it. Because once enough people surrender their ability to think, all that's needed is someone to give the orders. And that's where the danger turns into power. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram put this to the test. He wanted to understand how ordinary people, not sadists, not monsters, could carry out horrific actions under orders. So he designed an experiment that shocked the world. Participants were told they were part of a study on learning. A man in a lab coat, the authority figure, instructed them to administer electric shocks to another person whenever they gave a wrong answer. The shocks weren't real, but the participants didn't know that. And as the supposed shocks increased in intensity, the person in the other room screamed, begged, fell silent. Still, the man in the lab coat said, "The experiment requires that you continue." And most did. 65% of participants delivered shocks they believed could be lethal. They weren't evil, they weren't bloodthirsty, they were obedient. And obedience without conscience is exactly what Bonhoeffer feared. This is how blind ignorance becomes dangerous, not when it sits quietly, but when it marches under orders. Because when stupidity aligns with power, it no longer looks like confusion. It looks like order, like efficiency, like a system that works. People aren't shouting in protest, they're following the process. They're doing their jobs. They're avoiding trouble. They're just following orders. And in that obedience, atrocities are committed. Not by villains, but by people who have stopped thinking. By people who believe the system must know better, that their conscience can be outsourced. Milgram's experiment revealed the terrifying ease with which authority can override morality. How quickly people trade empathy for structure. How dangerous we become when we stop seeing ourselves as moral agents. And this isn't a thing of the past. Today, that authority might wear a suit, or run a platform, or post under a verified checkmark. It might be a political leader, a corporate algorithm, a cultural tribe. But the result is the same. People complying with systems they no longer question, doing harm they no longer notice, in the name of values they no longer understand. This is why Bonhoeffer didn't fear tyrants. He feared the systems that made tyranny easy, and the minds that made tyranny feel normal. Because once obedience becomes automatic, evil doesn't need to shout. It only needs to ask politely. And in today's world, it doesn't even need to ask. It just needs to suggest. Through curated feeds, through viral headlines, through invisible nudges that feel like our own thoughts. That's the new obedience. Not enforced by fear, but by design. We like to believe we're smarter now. We carry the world's knowledge in our pockets. We have access to experts, data, history, all just one search away. So why do we feel more divided than ever? Why do conspiracy theories thrive? Why do fake headlines dominate our feeds? Why do people still believe the Earth is flat while posting about it from space-connected smartphones? Here's the hard truth. We're not living in an age of information. We're drowning in an age of noise. And in that noise, reason doesn't win. Emotion does. A groundbreaking study from MIT in 2018 found that false information spread 6 times faster than true information on social media. Not because it's more accurate, but because it's more exciting. Because lies are crafted to provoke, to confirm what we want to believe. Truth, on the other hand, it's slow, it's nuanced. It asks us to pause and think, and thinking in today's world is inconvenient. This is why Bonhoeffer's warning is more relevant than ever. He wasn't just talking about ignorance, he was describing a system where truth has no chance. Because once stupidity becomes embedded in our structures, in media, in politics, in culture, it's not just a personal failure anymore. It becomes a collective virus. We forward things without reading them. We react before reflecting. We believe not what is proven, but what is shared. And every time we do, the algorithm learns. It feeds us more outrage, more tribalism, more shallow certainty. Until even the smartest people start mistaking volume for truth. And this is the cost. Not just confusion, but collapse, of dialogue, of empathy, of democracy itself. We've all done it. Shared something just because it felt right, even if we weren't sure it was true. Dismissed a fact simply because it came from the other side. Not out of malice, but because the system rewards certainty over curiosity. And in a world built to provoke reaction, that's not a personal flaw, it's a design feature. We are rewarded for emotional thinking. We are trained to react fast. We are punished for saying, "I'm not sure." And that's what Bonhoeffer meant when he said that stupidity is more dangerous than evil. Because it doesn't just destroy the truth, it makes us stop wanting it. And if we lose that, our hunger for understanding, our willingness to think deeply, to doubt ourselves, to wrestle with discomfort, then what's left? Noise. So much noise that reason itself gets buried. And in that silence, something dark begins to grow. Not because it's powerful, but because we've stopped asking questions. And once that silence takes hold, something else happens. We don't just stop questioning the world. We stop questioning ourselves. Have you ever defended an idea not because it was right, but because it was yours? Maybe it was something small, a belief, a memory, a political stance. Deep down, a part of you knew it didn't quite hold up, but admitting that, it felt like tearing away part of your identity. So you doubled down. You looked for facts that supported it, ignored the ones that didn't. Maybe you even convinced yourself you were being logical, when really you were just protecting yourself. That's not a weakness. That's human wiring. Psychologist Leon Festinger called it cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort we feel when we hold two conflicting beliefs at once. And the brain hates that feeling. So what does it do? It picks a side. Not always the right side, but the comfortable one. And once that comfort takes root, stupidity becomes a self-reinforcing loop. Here's the terrifying part. This mental process gets even stronger when we're stressed, overwhelmed, or afraid. In other words, the more uncertain the world feels, the less likely we are to think clearly, and the more likely we are to retreat into whatever belief feels safest. That's why conspiracy theories flourish during crises. That's why polarized politics harden during conflict. That's why people cling to simple lies over complicated truths, because the lie is easier to carry. The danger here isn't just emotional, it's neurological. The brain seeks coherence, not correctness. It rewards patterns, not principles. And if those patterns feel familiar, we'll accept them, even if they're false. We're not just being misled by others. We're being misled by ourselves. That's what makes this so dangerous. Bonhoeffer understood that stupidity wasn't just a social failure. It was a biological vulnerability. A loophole in our cognition that could be exploited by fear, by propaganda, by repetition. And once someone gives in to that, once they stop checking their thoughts, the descent into moral blindness isn't loud. It's quiet. It feels like peace. But it's really surrender. We all do it. Ignore the facts that make us uncomfortable. Bury the doubts that might crack our carefully built worldviews. Silence the quiet voice in our heads, not because we're sure we're right, but because we're afraid we might not be. If so, you're not broken, you're just human. But that's exactly why this matters. Because being human means you have the ability to choose awareness, to resist the mental shortcuts, to sit with discomfort, to ask, what if I'm wrong? Bonhoeffer wasn't fighting against stupid people. He was fighting against a system, internal and external, that rewards unthinking. And in today's world, with stress, fear, and information overload pushing us to react instead of reflect, resisting that system is an act of defiance. Thinking real, uncomfortable, slow thinking is no longer just a skill. It's a form of courage. But maybe there's more to it than just distraction or fear. Maybe stupidity, as we see it, isn't always a failure. Sometimes it's a strategy for survival. That's the idea behind the theory of rational ignorance. In economics, it means that staying uninformed can actually be a logical choice, especially when the cost of understanding is high and the personal payoff feels low. Reading every policy detail takes time and energy, especially when one vote won't shift the outcome. Learning the nuances of a global conflict demands effort, while a headline delivers simplicity. Challenging the system risks discomfort, alienation, even danger, while going along feels easier and safer. In a world overwhelmed by complexity, fear, and speed, this isn't laziness. It's survival logic. And that's what makes it even more dangerous. But here's the catch. What starts as a coping mechanism can become a cage. We stop asking hard questions. We outsource our thinking. We become passive passengers in systems that don't have our best interest at heart. Bonhoeffer saw this happen. People didn't suddenly become evil. They became efficient. They chose mental shortcuts. They accepted slogans, groupthink, and authority because it felt easier than thinking critically every single day. And that's what he called functional stupidity, the kind that works so well we don't even notice we've lost ourselves. So how do we resist? Not by trying to know everything, not by obsessing over being right, but by doing something far more radical, by thinking where others refuse to. That means slowing down, especially when emotions run high. It means asking, what am I missing, instead of how do I win? It means being skeptical, not of truth, but of comfort. Because comfort is the enemy of clarity. And if we're not careful, we'll fall into a world where critical thinking is punished, not by force, but by fatigue. A world where the truth is available, but buried under apathy. And in that world, stupidity isn't just tolerated. It's promoted. So what can you really do to stay sane? Start by asking inconvenient questions, even when the answers scare you. Push yourself to read past the headlines, especially when they confirm what you already believe. Learn to say, "I don't know," because there is far more power in humility than in loud certainty. And most importantly, seek out discomfort, not as a punishment, but as a necessary practice for growth and understanding. Because if stupidity thrives in convenience, then the antidote isn't intelligence. It's an effort to think, to reflect, to be morally awake, even when the world tries to lull you to sleep. Bonhoeffer didn't ask people to be geniuses. He asked them to be awake. Because when enough people think clearly, not just intellectually, but morally, systems change. And suddenly, stupidity stops working. But awakening isn't always easy. There comes a moment in every life when silence feels safer than speaking. When the crowd moves in one direction and your gut says no, but your mouth stays shut. When lies echo louder than truth, and the truth starts to feel lonely. That's the moment Bonhoeffer wrote for. Not for the philosophers, not for the powerful, but for the individual standing at the edge of their own conscience. In 1943, from a prison cell, Bonhoeffer wrote one question, just one. Who stands fast? Not who is the smartest, not who has all the facts, but who refuses to bend when thinking becomes dangerous. Bonhoeffer stood fast. He saw what was coming, the collapse of reason, the seduction of power, the rise of obedience masked as loyalty, and still he resisted. He spoke truth in a time of lies. He chose complexity over convenience. He chose sacrifice over safety. He was executed just weeks before the fall of the Nazi regime. His body was taken, but not his mind, not his voice, not his moral clarity. Because real resistance doesn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it's just refusing to nod, refusing to repeat, refusing to go along, when going along is the easiest thing in the world. And in a time when stupidity was weaponized, Bonhoeffer's greatest act wasn't protest. It was thinking loudly, clearly, morally. So now the question is yours. Will you stand fast? Not in grand moments, but in the quiet ones. When the meme feels right but isn't true. When the crowd cheers, but your conscience whispers no. When certainty is easy, but complexity is honest. Will you slow down when everything around you screams to react? Will you keep your mind sharp not just to be smart, but to be free? Because the threat Bonhoeffer warned us about, the danger of stupidity disguised as virtue, it's not gone. It's on your feed, in your workplace, in your family, and yes, sometimes in your own reflection. But so is the resistance. It starts with a question. It grows with a pause. It lives in those who dare to think when thinking is hard. So before this ends, let's return to where we started. Have you ever followed the crowd when you should have stood alone? If yes, good, because that means you've seen the trap. And now, you can choose not to fall in.